I'm Dominic Power at Imperial College London. So I'm going to be talking about parallel transport in the scope-off layer today. By parallel transport, I mean transport along the magnetic field lines in the scope-off layer. So we want to understand things like heat flux to the wall, that kind of thing. So it's now fairly widely known that some of the commonly used fluid codes fail to accurately simulate the conditions at the target in comparison to the experiment. So this means we can't reliably predict heat fluxes to the walls in future reactors like ITER. So there's some suggestions that kinetic effects might be the cause of this disparity. So I'll hopefully explain during the talk about why we think that's the case. But before doing that, I'll go over some of the key aspects of exhaust physics and kind of how they relate to kinetics. And this diagram just shows what we mean by the scope-off layer. Cool, so the first part of the puzzle is detachment. So during detachment, we have these steep temperature gradients along the length of the scope-off layer, and the plasma then encounters this cloud of neutral particles, and this in front of the target, and this facilitates a huge variety of complex atomic and molecular physics. And next we have, in front of the target, we have the plasma sheath, and we have this large potential drop. And this accelerates ions and repels electrons that cross the sheath boundary and distorts their velocity distributions. And conditions here tend to backfill upstream, kind of define the behavior of the scope-off layer. Another important process is physical sputtering of impurity species into the edge plasma. And here we want to quantify the amount of energy radiated away by impurities, and also the degree to which they migrate upstream and into the core plasma. Finally, in exhaust physics, we really want to understand the response of the edge plasma to core instabilities. So we want to know how resilient is detachment to this kind of burst of energies, and whether or not we exceed the maximum heat loads that our wall materials can withstand, that kind of thing. So here's an example of how it's often done. So there's these fluid codes that have fairly realistic geometry, lots of different physical processes. And one of the problems with this approach, aside from some of the discrepancies with the experiment, is it's really hard to disentangle some of the physics from the results because there's so much going on. So as I kind of alluded to already, we might be missing some kinetic effects in this approach as well. So the presence of all these different phenomena that you see here act to distort the distribution functions of our plasma species from Maxwellian. This means that some of the fluid plasma models might not be appropriate. So I guess I need to justify that a little bit. So I'll take the example of steep temperature gradients as an example. So in regions where you get these rapid decreases in temperature, then the fast particles, which are less collisional, can escape beyond the region of the temperature gradient and then deposit their energy elsewhere. And fluid models don't capture this effect. So here's an example. There's quite a lot going on here, but this is an example from Alex Jankin at Max Planck Institute, where a kinetic and a fluid model for the heat flow are used to predict heat flow in a jet-like scope-off flare. The point is, they don't agree, which is quite interesting. So the approach I'm taking in my research is to start from a kinetic model, but have fairly simplified geometry, initially reduced amount of physics. So this is the VFP equation. And one of the really hard part here is the stuff on the right, the collision operators, but we need to get it right. We want to accurately capture the kinetic effects and what's going on. So I'm using this code Solkit, which is written by a friend of mine at Imperial, who's now at CCFE. And this treats the scope-off layer as a 1D problem. And the aim here really, as I kind of said before, is to understand the edge plasma dynamics and also isolate kinetic effects by comparing it to a fluid model. So I can present some results from using this code Solkit. So this is looking at the ratio of the kinetic predicted heat flow to the fluid predicted heat flow at the target during a transient event like an edge localized mode. And in some conditions, we see pretty strong enhancement. Another example result from this code is looking at differences in the energy transfer between electrons and ions when we treat it kinetically or if we treat it with a fluid approximation. And again, there's differences. For example, this might manifest as different sputtering rates at the target. Cool. So now I'll just introduce some of the future things I'd like to work on. So one of those is looking at the kind of overall impact on detachment of a kinetic treatment. So to do this, we need to really model the transfer of energy, momentum and particles between the plasma and the neutral species to really capture what's going on. Another area is in molecular physics. So we'd like to know kind of how valid are these assumptions of Maxwellian averaged reaction rates that are often used in fluid modeling of molecular physics. Is this valid or not? Similarly, in impurity physics, we want to quantify the kind of transport into the core and how much energy they radiate away. But again, often in fluid modeling, we use these Maxwellian averaged reaction rates. We want to know if that's accurate or not. Specifically in impurities, we think that's probably not. We think there probably are some kinetic effects present. And the reason for this is that a lot of plasma impurity reactions, like electron impact ionization of tungsten that you see here, have really high threshold energies. And that means they're going to be really sensitive to the exact shape of the distribution function, the electrons in particular. So we'd really like to kind of model this and look at differences when we treat this stuff kinetically to understand impurity transport. Cool, so that was it. So a really quick kind of tour of kinetic modeling and scope of flare, but hopefully kind of been able to explain sort of why we care and some of the work that's been done so far. So thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Dominic. That was indeed a very interesting talk about the edge physics.